Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for Spirit, the stimulating program initiative for retirees that inspires thought. I'm Judy Steinig, Director of Community Programs for the Orthodox Union, and it's my honor to coordinate and host this program. The OU started Spirit several years ago as an on-site program, and now we're happy to present it as an online program for empty nesters, baby boomers, retirees, not yet retirees, sandwich generation parents, and seniors, everybody who is looking for educational, intellectual, and spiritual growth. Now, during the pandemic, as we all continue to shelter in, whether or not we've gotten our vaccines yet, Spirit has become the perfect way for all of us to engage in a virtual setting. Today, we will be learning how to access resources when a loved one may be seriously ill. Our presenter is Toby Weiss, MSOD, who is the Director of Cultural Sensitivity and Jewish Programming at MJHS Hospice and Palliative Care. It is my honor to turn the Spirit Forum over to Toby Weiss. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you, Judy. Does everybody hear me? I'm just doing a sound check. Yeah?
Yeah, we're good. We're good.
Okay. So let me first say thank you to the OU for having the Spirit program and for all of the initiatives and programs that you've undertaken since the start of the pandemic. And Judy, I want to thank you personally for reaching out to me. I have a great deal of respect for you and for the OU. And I hope that the information that I'm going to share with you today will be well received and useful. Let me tell you just a little bit about me so you can understand my interest and passion in this work and how I came to the space. I'm a child, I'm Orthodox, obviously. I'm a child of 2 Holocaust survivors, and I was a primary caregiver for them. And for my mother, who passed away in 1998, I was faced with a dilemma when the oncologist told me that I should be moving her to where I live, cross state, and get hospice. And I got very angry at this doctor who was Shomer Shabbos. And I looked at him and I said, my mother survived Hitler and you're going to give up on her? Are you kidding me? I said, and you expect me to handcuff her and drag her across state lines to move her from New Jersey to New York? Are you kidding me? And by the way, how much time do we have? And he said, I don't think she'll make it through the summer. It was June of 97. And you should be getting hospice. And when she can't do it anymore, she's not going to fight you. And that's what happened. And so we moved my mother to me, and lo and behold, we got hospice. And instead of living for a few weeks, she ended up living for 10 months. And when somebody tells you that you have days or weeks and that person lives for 10 months, it makes you realize that there's only one power in this world, and it's not you, and it's not me, and it's not the doctors. Every day was a blessing. But what I realized in retrospect was that this thing called hospice that I was resistant to, threatened by, and afraid of, was actually something very, very good, because it anticipated our needs before we even knew that we were going to have them. And we were able to care for her in the comfort of my home with the love of all of her children and grandchildren around her. And it was actually, it was meaningful and it was beautiful. Yet, there were 2 things that were very, very much missing from our care. One was that the hospice that we had in place had no understanding of who my mother was as a Jew, and they had zero understanding of who she was as a Holocaust survivor. And so after she passed away, I made a vow that I would find a way to give back and improve how care can be delivered to people within our community, so that there would be an understanding of who they are and what their lives stood for. And so that was my entree. I learned about this organization called Metropolitan Jewish Health System. And I was invited to join the advisory board, which I sat on in a voluntary capacity for 7 or 8 years. And then I ended up getting an email from a membership organization that I was affiliated with based on my professional credentials. And the email was about a grant management position for a 1-year grant given by UJA Federation of New York. And the name of the grant was Increasing Access to Palliative Care for the Orthodox Jewish Community. I was like, whoa, I didn't find it, it found me. It fell in my lap, and I decided to put my professional practice on hold for 1 year to live out my commitment, and told them that if they were interested in me, I would only be able to give part-time work, but I would be willing to do it, and they would get full-time work product out of me because I was consultant, time is money. Anyway, I did that work, and the deliverables were so successful that the grant kept getting renewed for 5 years, and then 2 years later, 2 cycles of a Holocaust survivor grant, and the rest is history. But just so that you know, I'm involved in this work since 1998. And I am gratified to be able to speak to you today and share with you some of the information that I believe can make a difference for you and for those that you love and may be caring for. So why is it not moving? Why is my screen not moving? Oh, there we go. Okay. What we're going to go over today is how to define and discuss advanced care planning and advanced directives. We're going to speak about this a little bit more later. I flipped the order of the presentation, realized that advanced care planning is the conversation and advanced directives are the forms. Okay, so just hold that hunt to that. We're going to define and distinguish between hospice and palliative care. I'm going to speak a little bit about the halachic implications of end-of-life care, and we're going to talk about how you can advocate for loved ones and for yourself. So some of the advantages of hospice and palliative care, both aim to relieve symptom burden and are delivered by interdisciplinary teams, meaning that you have every discipline, a doctor, a nurse, social worker, bereavement support, home health aide, all of the different disciplines are included in the care. And the aim is to address both the need of the patient as well as the family. And this last line is very, very important for you to understand. All hospice is palliative care, but not all palliative care is hospice. And we're going to go into more about what that means. So there is a definition through the National Consensus Project of Quality Palliative Care about what palliative care is, and it is that it's patient and family-centered care that optimizes quality of life and seeks to prevent and relieve pain and suffering and ensure the highest possible quality of life, regardless, this is the operative phrase here, regardless of age of the individual or stage of serious or life-limiting illness. Palliative care addresses physical, intellectual, emotional, social, spiritual needs through access to information and choice. The reason the green, I highlighted the green, regardless of age of the individual stage of serious or life-limiting illness, is because I want you to understand palliative care can be utilized across the board, regardless of what kind of illness a person has. And it doesn't have to be in a terminal stage of illness. When we talk about hospice, on the other hand, which is a specialist level of palliative care, it is holistic. It focuses on supportive comfort care to improve quality of life during the terminal stage of a life-limiting illness. So that is a huge differential between hospice and palliative care. Both are palliative nature, meaning that they are holistic across all disciplines and all domains of care. But hospice is specialist level, treating a person throughout the terminal stage of an illness. Hospice is a federal benefit. It's billed through Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance. And even for someone who doesn't have insurance, there's also charity care. What is important to realize is that the focus is on comfort and improving quality of life without trying to cure whatever the disease is. This graph is very, very easy to understand, and I think very, very important for you to get a handle on. So if you look at the chart, you see that in the lighter green area where it says disease modifying therapy, what that's showing you is when somebody is diagnosed with a life-limiting illness. I'm going to use an example just for example's sake, just for argument's sake, to illustrate what I'm talking about. So if you use, let's say cancer, whichever kind of cancer, and a person is diagnosed with cancer early on, of course, we are all going to try to cure that disease. We want to prevent the spread of the cancer. And we undergo chemotherapy and radiation oncology and all kinds of experimental treatment. Whatever is out there, we're going to pursue because we want to be cured and we want to prevent the spread of disease and stop the spread of the cancer cells. In the course of receiving disease modifying therapy, there are side effects, right? Chemotherapy puts poison into our body. We welcome it. Why? Because we want to stop the cancer from growing. But when we use chemotherapy and other kinds of treatments, there are side effects such as nausea, anxiety, pain, other kinds of symptoms. And so even though we're trying to cure the disease, we can utilize palliative care for the pain and symptom management. If you knew anyone that was getting chemotherapy and they had terrible nausea or dizziness to the degree that they couldn't eat and they were losing weight, but they were still going to continue those treatments, there's medications that are considered palliative in nature to help manage the nausea and to stimulate their appetite. There's all different things that we could do that are considered palliative in nature. As the disease, though, over time progresses, the utilization of palliative care also progresses and less curative treatments are being used. And that's where you see the darker green growing in size and the disease modifying therapies becoming less until it gets to a point where the physician may say, look, we really cannot use this treatment. We can't give you chemo or radiation anymore because it may be harmful than helpful because the body is so debilitated and weakened. And it's at that point where the transition to hospice becomes obvious as the appropriate level of care. And a person remains on hospice, and it is all considered palliative care. And a person remains on hospice until their passing, and then even after the passing, there is bereavement support for the family for 13 months. So it is holistic in nature. So how is hospice paid for? It's a Medicare covered benefit. It's covered by Medicaid as well, private insurances. All a person needs to do is they sign the election of benefits so that the insurance company pays it. There's no copays. If a person has private insurance or long-term care insurance, you just speak to your care manager. They're able to explain and tell you what the benefit is. If you are less than, if you're not yet Medicare eligible, if you're less than 65, your private insurance can also support and pay for hospice. And as I mentioned earlier, I'll say it again, even for those that are indigent, there is charity care for people that are underinsured. Hospice comes to wherever a person resides, whether it's at their home, a nursing home, a child's home, even a homeless shelter. It goes to wherever the patient resides. It's interdisciplinary in nature. I mentioned this earlier. There is a complete complement of different folks that are caring for the individual. It is the nurse, the RN case manager, that is the coordinator of care. Everyone on the care team is board certified in pain and palliative care. If it's a physician, it's pain and palliative medicine, a nurse, end-of-life nursing, social worker, palliative care social worker. They're all certified and educated specifically around end-of-life needs. The hospice eligibility criteria is interesting. There's only 2 hospice eligibility criteria. Now, I want you to know that hospice was developed, it came into creation only in the late 70s. Actually, Metropolitan Jewish Hospice and Palliative Care was one of the original hospice pilot programs in the country through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. And There was 2 eligibility criteria then that remain in place today. And believe it or not, this 6-month prognosis was decided by bureaucrats in Washington, not by physicians, and it has stayed in place ever since. So the first eligibility criterion is that 2 physicians, it's generally the overseeing physician as well as a hospice physician, would both certify that based on their best clinical judgment, if the disease, or with the primary hospice disease for which they're being referred, if it were to follow its natural course, b'derech hateva, without doing any kind of curative treatments, that within about 6 months to a year, the person would succumb to that disease. That's one eligibility criterion. 2 doctors certify terminal stage of disease. And the second criterion is simply that the patient is no longer seeking to aggressively cure their disease. It means they are not looking to, they realize the disease is not going to go away, but they still want to be managed as best as possible and be as pain and symptom free as possible and have the highest quality of life for as many days, weeks, months, years as Hashem gives us on this earth. So because these bureaucrats in Washington determined that the hospice benefit would be for a prognosis of 6 to 12 months, then there is a requirement to be recertified once a person is on hospice. So what that looks like is when a person is on a hospice program, they need to have a physician reevaluation to recertify eligibility at the end of a 90-day period, after the first 3 months, again after the next 90-day period, and then every 60 days, every 2 months, for as long as a person remains on hospice. There are 4 different levels of care. This is very important information, so you have a better understanding of the model of care that hospice follows. There's 4 levels of care. The first one, which is known as routine home hospice, and really which more than 95% of people in the United States that are on hospice, this is the level of care that they are on. Routine home hospice cares for a person in their home. As I mentioned earlier, it provides the full complement, the interdisciplinary team, and home health aid. All of the medicines and durable medical equipment are covered. There are no copays. All of the care comes to the individual, the spiritual care provider, the nurse, social worker, even a volunteer, modest number of home health aid hours, certain kinds of interventions, therapeutic interventions. The person needs a speech and swallow test, something like that. And it's for as long as a person can be managed adequately well and stable. This is the level of care that they are on. So that's the baseline. But let's say a person has some sort of critical event or a decline, and they have all of a sudden some acute symptoms, whether it's pain, severe agitation, or breathlessness, some sort of acute symptomatology, which cannot feasibly be managed well enough on this routine home hospice benefit. In that scenario, there are 2 options that are available. One is called GIP, or general inpatient level of care, in which a person would be transitioned from their residence, from wherever it is that they're living, either again, home, nursing home, assisted living, child's home, wherever, to a hospice inpatient bed, which can be in a hospital that the hospice contracts with, or in a standalone hospice inpatient unit, or in a nursing home that is contracted with for inpatient beds. And is when a person needs a higher acuity level of care setting with higher technology needs that cannot be managed in the home. It is not for long-term care. The goal of care is to stabilize that person and make them symptom-free again so that they can be transitioned back to home, which is where they really want to be. That's GIP level of care. It's, again, it is based purely on clinical evaluation and need. It is short-term in nature with the goal of stabilizing, managing the symptoms, and bringing them back home. However, sometimes there are patients that are at home, they're on routine home hospice benefit, and they have some sort of change in their clinical status where there are some acute symptoms, but they absolutely, b'shum ofen, they do not want to leave their home. They don't want to go to a facility. but they're still having these acute symptoms. They need to be managed. And in those circumstances, when it's possible, they are transitioned to continuous care or crisis care, where a nurse, a licensed practical nurse or an RN, depending on the need, can be placed in the home, either anywhere from 8 to 24 hours a day. Sometimes it's a home health aide, 12 hours a day, and a licensed practical nurse for 12 hours a day. And it is also based purely on clinical evaluation and need. When there is a need for a licensed nurse to be present to oversee that care, or for some sort of intervention that must have a licensed practitioner present. Again, it is for symptom management and stabilization. It is not long-term. And when a person is stable, then they transition back to the routine home hospice level of care. But they were able to be managed and have those symptoms managed in their home. The fourth level of care is something called respite care. Now, I'm going to tell you about it because it is definitely a benefit under the hospice federal benefit, but most people today in the time of COVID, I would not recommend and are not utilizing this, but let me explain to you what it is, because please God, we should get over this hurdle and see some resumption of normalcy. So I want you to understand what this respite benefit is. So if you're a primary caregiver, whether it's for a spouse or a parent or any other person that you are connected to, and you are just simply burnt out and you need respite, or maybe you have a child that lives in a different part of the country or a different part of the world and you need to visit them for a simcha, or you're going on a vacation, or you have a business trip, or whatever, you need someone to be managing your loved one because you cannot leave town or disconnect unless they are being managed well. So respite allows for a loved one, a patient, to be transitioned to a nursing home that the hospice contracts with. They stay there on hospice, but in this nursing home facility for up to 5 days. You replenish or do what you need to do, and then the loved one comes back home. Everything continues as was, but you have the respite, the 5-day respite option, and that can be tapped into once each certification period. So it would be once in 3 months, once in the second 3 months, and then each 60-day certification period thereafter. One of the very important parts of hospice support includes hospice family meetings. This is a very, very important thing to understand because it allows the family members. Hospice doesn't just care for the patient, it cares for the entire family, whether it's the primary caregiver or the children or the grandchildren. It is for the whole family. And there are very often fears, concerns, questions, anxieties, and the family meetings allow for surfacing of that information so that the caregiving team can explain how these issues can be addressed. Of great importance, I cannot impress upon you enough, one of the most important functions of the family meetings is the discussions around goals of care, which deal with the comfort and quality of life for the loved one versus what was happening prior to hospice, which was the curative regressive treatments. There's no two people that are the same. What one person wants is not necessarily what another person wants. What somebody in the family wants for a loved one may or may not be what the loved one himself or herself would want. The goals of care discussion are aimed at reviewing what the plan of care will look like in adherence to what the patient would want in their best interests and in alignment with the family and the patient's values and beliefs. It is a very, very important piece. I'm going to be speaking about it a little bit more later, and it requires, in the best case scenario, all of the right people to be part of that discussion. Advanced directives are also reviewed when you have the family meetings. They may need to be updated, they may need to be changed in some way, or they may remain in place, but they are reviewed. So let's talk then about the importance of discussing end-of-life issues. Everyone on this webinar, I'm sure, has seen the words informed consent. If you go to a doctor, if you go to a hospital, if you go for any kind of a treatment, there is something called informed consent. And basically what it means is that you understand the kind of care or the kind of treatment or the kind of intervention you can be getting, and that you are accepting of it. And the reason that's important is because when they bill for a treatment of any kind, there needs to also be evidence that a person has agreed to want this treatment. And this fits very, very nicely into the culture, the Western medical culture, with the notion of self-determination reigning supreme. Now, it used to be many, many moons ago, many, many years ago, that when a person would go to medical school and they would graduate and they would take the Hippocratic Oath, there was what reigned supreme early on was the concept of paternalism, meaning that the physician knows best and the physician is going to do what's in the best interest of the patient. Well, over the last couple of decades in the United States, what has been lifted up more within the Western medical culture is self-determination, meaning I get to say what's best for me and you're going to follow what I want. And part of the, while I'm not making a comment on whether that's good or bad, I will say that part of the, within a Jewish community, within an observant Jewish community, then it becomes relevant to say that it was through this type of evolving change in the medical culture in this country, in the United States, that arrived at euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. And it based, again, on this notion of self-determination. We, of course, within the Orthodox Jewish community have an issue with much of this. Some of the recent legislation that I want to point out to you that I think is very important, and these are just in the last decade. There is something called the Palliative Care Information Act, the Palliative Care Access Act, the Family Healthcare Decisions Act, and then an addendum to the Family Healthcare Decisions Act called the Isolated Patient Bill. The Palliative Care Information Act now mandates, it requires of a physician who diagnoses a patient with a life-limiting illness, the physician is now required to share information with that patient about the life-limiting illness and what all of the curative as well as non-curative interventions are for that person to be able to access. When the bill first came out, when the act was first enacted, it mandated that physicians have to tell patients about palliative care. There was lobbying on the part of the Aguda, and it added an addendum to say that if a person, based on their cultural values and beliefs, opts not to hear this information, they can reject hearing it and the physician will not be penalized for it. Why would a person not want to hear it? Well, we know, I think you probably on this call know as well, that sometimes a person doesn't want to hear very dire information. And they may say, talk to my child, or you know what, I prefer not to hear this. Right now, I am in the mode of, I want to do everything possible. I don't need to hear this. The Palliative Care Access Act is something that was passed which makes hospitals now accountable for how they care for a patient, and of great importance, how they discharge a patient. How many times is a patient in the hospital where I've heard from family members, they're trying to throw my mom out of the hospital. They don't want to keep her anymore. And then they're trying to push her into this direction or that direction. The Palliative Care Access Act requires that if a patient has a life-limiting illness and they are doing a planning a discharge for that patient, they have to first of all make sure that the discharge plan is one that ensures a safe plan for the individual and affords that individual the appropriate and necessary type of care. That's very important. They also have to offer several options. You can't push a person in one direction. They have to provide at least 3 options. Why is this important? If a hospital discharges a patient, I'm using now hospice as an example, who is terminally ill, very much in the midst of that terminal stage of the disease, and they try to push the patient into a rehab, into a nursing home with a rehab. And the nursing home would prefer a rehab patient because it's a higher reimbursement rate, but really that patient needs hospice. That's the most appropriate level of care. And they send a person, and a rehab takes them, and then the patient bounces back into the hospital for the same reason they were previously hospitalized. Guess what happens? The hospital is penalized. They're fined. They have to send back the money that they were reimbursed from CMS. The rehab gets penalized and they get fined. And the reason for all of this is because of one thing. There's a model now of shared risk, not shared profit, but shared risk. And what that means is that everyone that works in the healthcare space must be accountable for their actions. You have to do what is in the best interest of that patient. So if a person should appropriately go home on home care, you have to make sure that it's the best home care for that person. If the person requires hospice, and you got to make sure that you're giving them the right hospice based on the family's wishes, needs, and interests, and you have to offer them the options. Sending someone to a rehab when they should be going home on a different level of care, or again, wherever home is really a responsibility that the hospital has to bear. Now, the Family Healthcare Decisions Act, this is a fabulous law that was passed, and this was passed in 2010 also. Family Healthcare Decision Act, while it is a fabulous law, has a flaw in the law. What is the Family Healthcare Decisions Act? It puts in place a hierarchy, a priority list of who can make decisions on the part of a person who no longer has decisional capacity. If I am no longer competent, if I cannot reason through information logically, process that information, and make a reasonable decision, it could be a bad decision, but make a reasonable decision based on what I want. If I no longer have quote unquote decisional capacity, then I can no longer make decisions for myself. If I have not designated a healthcare agent, if I have not signed a healthcare proxy, designating who I trust to speak for me, if I can no longer speak for myself, whether on a temporary basis or a permanent basis. If I don't have a healthcare agent, the Family Healthcare Decisions Act comes into place, and it has this priority list. The hierarchy starts with a spouse. It moves then to children, 18 years or older. It goes then to a parent. It goes then to a family, a close family, a family or close friend. And then ultimately it falls on the shoulders of a physician or healthcare professional. I think that the hierarchy makes sense. It is a reasonable order to look at. However, the flaw in the law, which I consider to be a flaw in the law, is that within each category, it does not create a priority system. Now, look, we're talking to pre-retirees, post-retirees, we're talking a sandwich generation, baby boomers. We're talking to an older group. We're not talking to Gen X or Gen Z or millennials, right? We're talking to an older group of people, of which I am a card-carrying member. And let's face it, you don't have the same if you are blessed enough to have children, multiple children, or even one child, but certainly if you have multiple children, you don't have the same relationship with each one. You may love them all equally, but you don't look to each of them, to all of them in the same way for different things, because our children have different strengths. They have different personalities. There are things that are easier for them or more difficult for them. And so when you think about this category, this hierarchy, and you think about children over 18 faced with decision making when it comes to issues that are very, very, very not only important, but scary, and putting person in a vulnerable place, you want to make sure that the person who is best equipped to carry out your wishes and understand what your wishes may be should be the one who's the point person. Because otherwise there will be conflict in the family again. And the family dynamics can become very, very fraught with tension when different kids want different things from mom or dad. So I just use this as an illustration. And then at the end of the day, the safety net, again, which is a good safety net, is that the healthcare professional physician is going to make decisions for you. But guess what? if you end up, God forbid, in a hospital, or your mom ends up in a hospital, and the attending physician is caring for this person and doesn't know this individual from Adam, that physician is going to be making decisions without any knowledge of their values and beliefs and their wishes. It's going to go based purely on Western medical concepts of care, which is not all bad. It's pretty good. But when it comes to very serious issues, particularly when you're talking about halachic implications, particularly when you're talking about life and death situations, you want people who are better informed and knowledgeable about this human being. The Isolated Patient Bill, which is an addendum to the Family Healthcare Decisions Act, is basically a law that now, if a person ends up in the hospital without decisional capacity and you cannot, they do a due diligence search and they cannot find family or friends that know this individual and the person is terminally ill, a physician, again, who doesn't know this patient can make a referral to hospice, but it would also mean, and within hospice, you have the concept of withholding, withdrawing life-sustaining treatment because it's no longer curative treatment. If you don't know the individual, you don't know what they do want or what they don't want. On hospice, you could still get antibiotics, you could still get hydration and nutrition, you could still get all kinds of treatments that may not be cured. It's not going to cure the cancer, it's not going to take away the dementia, but it's certainly going to be in accordance with how a person lived and what they would want when they die. So without having somebody as a spokesperson that knows this individual, there are a lot of risks that are in place. So it moves us to the topic of information.
Toby, I'm sorry, before you go on, a
Yeah.
question was asked, or a request. Could you please repeat the hierarchy of the FHCDA? You
Yes.
could just do it again.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you, but I want you, but write down, if you have a piece of paper, write down Family Healthcare Decisions Act. You could also Google it and you can read about it and you'll understand it as well, but I will tell you what it is. It starts with a spouse. It then goes to adult children over 18. Then it goes to parents. Obviously, if we're talking about a child who's a minor, the parents would be primary. Okay, but we're talking now about adults, so you're talking about spouse, adult children, parents, family members or close friends, and then healthcare professional. So now we're going to talk about these very difficult but very important conversations. Advanced care planning, as I mentioned when I just started to talk to you today, advanced care planning is a conversation. It is not a document. It is conversations that should be iterative and reiterative. It is not a one and done. I can't see everybody. I don't need to see everybody. But if I pose this question to you and I say, how many people in this audience already have a healthcare proxy in place? I would hope to believe that some of you, if not most of you, have one. How many people have a living will? How many people have a medical directive? I hope that some of you have this in place. My point, though, is that when I say it's not a one and done and that it's an iterative process, what I mean to say is that I happen to be 62 years old. When I'm 72, please God, should I be here, I may not feel the same way then as I feel today. When I'm 82 or 92, I may not feel the same way as I feel today. And my medical situation, my health may not be the same then as it is now. And because of that, it requires ongoing review and reflection because you may need to change whatever health directives you have in place. You may need to change a healthcare proxy if the person you designate is no longer here or no longer available. So advanced care planning is about the conversation. What I believe, and I tell this to people all the time, is that the most difficult conversation is the one that you have with yourself. Because if you cannot have it with yourself, how the heck are you going to have it with the people that you love most? So you need to have this conversation and reflect on about what's important to you so that you can share it with those people that are important to you. When you have the conversation, you should have the people that are the most important around you when you share what your wishes are. It may be helpful also to speak with a Rav. I know that I have, and believe me, I've been in the middle of my advanced care planning for over a year with an attorney, and I can't seem to finish it because there's a lot of questions that come up that you don't know the answers to and you're not sure about. But you have to think about who do you need to speak to, in addition to yourself internally, in order to arrive at decisions that you can feel comfortable with and and will unburden you and will unburden the people that you rely on, your kids, your family members, your close friends. So that's advanced care planning. Advanced directives are the legal documents that formalize and legalize your wishes. So there are different kinds of advanced directives in place. There's a DNR, DNI, right? There's also a DNH. Do not resuscitate, do not intubate, do not hospitalize. There's a difference between an in-hospital DNR and an out-of-hospital DNR. If you went to a hospital, let's say you broke a hip, you went to the hospital, you went to rehab, you end up back in the hospital for something else 2 years later. Each time you go to the hospital, even if you went week after week or year after year, however many times, hopefully none of us have to go to the hospital, but every time you do go to the hospital, they're going to make you sign a DNR. They're certainly going to ask you about the DNR for you to sign or not sign. But when you go home, when you leave the hospital, that DNR doesn't go with you. At home, you need to have an out-of-hospital DNR, because if you don't have one, if your choice is not to be resuscitated, if a person, let's say, was in their 90s and they had CHF, they had congestive heart failure, and they would not want to be resuscitated, they would not want their chest to be cracked and compressions being done. If they don't have an out-of-hospital DNR that is visible and 911 or Hatzalah is called, that somebody comes to their house because their heart stopped, they don't see, the EMTs don't see the DNR, they start chest compressions. So you need to understand that there's a difference between an in-hospital and an out-of-hospital directive known as a DNR. A healthcare proxy. You can have a healthcare proxy is the document. The healthcare agent is the person. You can have a healthcare agent that is documented on a healthcare proxy. All it requires are 2 witnesses. You do not need a lawyer to sign a healthcare proxy. It should not be, in the best case scenario, it should not be family members, to avoid any kind of conflict of interest or concern in that direction. It could be, but it's really not preferable. All you need, though, are 2 witnesses to sign it, that they witnessed you designating the person and your signature. You can also designate an alternate healthcare proxy, which is suggested whenever possible, so that if one person is not available, another one can be contacted. They can have equal agency, or you can make one the first and then the alternate the second. A rabbi can also be a healthcare agent, and in fact, that is why the halachic medical directive, one of the reasons that the halachic medical directive is so important, because it allows for a Rav to be a healthcare agent, which you'll see, I'm going to get into it a little bit more on the next slide, but the halachic medical directive is phenomenal. The fact that we have them across different denominations within the Jewish community is very helpful as well. The RCA had one, the Aguda has one, I believe the conservative movement has one, even the reform movement had. So a halachic medical directive is very, very important. And the healthcare proxy card and a halachic medical directive, in both cases, there is a wallet size that you could put into your wallet. I advise everyone to do it, because God forbid you walk in the street and you black out, even though it may be temporary. A good Samaritan will call 911 or Hatzalah, will then look in your personal and your wallet to find out who you are. And then if the healthcare proxy card is in there, then that good Samaritan knows who to call and inform them about your situation. There's a living will document known as the 5 wishes. Write those 2 words down. I encourage all of you to Google that. You could take a look at what it is. I love the 5 wishes. I distribute the 5 wishes. When I do presentations at work, 5 wishes is a living will that is a very non-threatening document. It asks 5 general questions that really evoke a lot of thought and reflection in a very calm and tame way, in a very user-friendly way. And you just sit yourself down with a cup of coffee at a window or wherever your comfortable place is and look through it. It is very, very helpful. What I love most about the 5 wishes is the 5th wish, which, in terms of our community, I would say that it speaks to issues of an ethical will, of a tzava'a. and it allows for you to think about what is the information that you would like to share, that you would like to impart on those that you leave behind that you may not have had the opportunity to speak about earlier. There are many halachic implications. I'm not a Rav, I don't pretend to be one, I don't want to be one, thank God, but I want to give you some idea of the halachic implications when we're talking about end of life. I spoke earlier about the Western medical culture and the self-determination, but there's a bigger issue. There is really an inherent tension between the Western medical community and the Jewish medical ethical community. And that tension comes from a difference in belief in anything that relates to withholding or withdrawing life-sustaining treatment, because in our faith, we believe in Hashem as the ultimate authority, who knows how many days we'll be here, and we grasp onto the biblical imperative of Ubacharta b'chayim, that we shall extend and preserve life for as long as possible. Within the Western medical community, the notion of futility comes into place, where a person will say, well, this person's, what kind of quality of life will this person have? That is not something that we abide by. When we think about futility, we consider each breath to be infinitely of value. Whether or not a person wants to continue aggressive treatment is a different story, but we hold life as infinitely of value. When we talk about hospice or not hospice, but end of life care, where the rubber meets the road is in the questions that relate to treatments that are either withholding or withdrawing, right? So it is much more problematic halachically to withdraw a treatment than it is to withhold a treatment. So I could passively not intubate someone, but if someone is intubated, then to withdraw, to extubate them is far more complex from a halachic standpoint. In all of the scenarios related to shilas, when it comes to questions of medical interventions that relate to end of life or withholding or withdrawing of treatments, it is incumbent upon everyone to seek guidance from a Rav who is considered a posek. I have to tell you that I get this question all the time. I happen to also be an ethics consultant, and I'm on the ethics committee at work, something I'm passionate about. And I get a question all the time. I do a lot of education. When somebody comes onto hospice, they're signing an election of benefits that says that they know that they're getting hospice, and an informed consent. They know that they're getting hospice. But guess what? In our community, I can't begin to tell you how many people say when we get a referral, say, don't use the word hospice. They don't know that they're going on hospice. Don't use the H word. And why do people say that? Because we're protective of our loved ones. And one of the reasons we don't want people to lose hope. We don't want them to despair. We don't want them to lose hope and give up, because that would be considered hastening death. There are so many issues. I contend, it happens to me, that, when I say, I'll ask a whole group of clinicians, do you think it's reasonable if somebody says don't use the hospice word, that you could take somebody onto program and have them sign an informed consent and election benefits when they don't know it's hospice? And everybody, well, not everybody, but people say, no, you can't do that. That's not ethical. And I say, I beg to differ. And I do beg to differ, because I believe that if you explain, and this is for you now, I'm telling you this now, if you explain a healthcare option, a care option, without using a word that's scary, but you're truthful and telling them exactly what they will be getting or not get, but not use the word hospice. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm telling you the truth. You're going to get an interdisciplinary team of care that's going to come to you. They're going to manage all of your pain and symptoms. A nurse is going to be coming to you weekly, if not more often. You're going to have a social worker. You're going to have all of your medicines. It's all going to be covered under the home care benefit. It's all going to come to you. I don't need to say you're getting hospice. All I need to do is tell the truth, because hospice means different things to different people based on their perception. If I tell the truth about what a person is getting based on the care option and the regulations, that's fair. So there are a lot of issues that we can use a lot of tools to explain this without worrying about a person losing hope or despairing. It also happens to be that the truth is that most often people do know that when they're in hospice that they're dying. They are trying to protect their children. The children are protecting them. It's this big game of, hide and seek. We're trying to protect one another. But when a person is at the end of life and their clinical situation changes and there is a goals of care discussion because the new care plan needs to be put into place, I would urge all people, if you haven't done so already, and if you are unsure, do speak to a RUV, because a RUV will be able to decipher and to think through the information. However, with that being said, there's a caveat. I have seen far too often that when the family says to the clinician, I have to speak to my rabbi, and then the family member or the family members speak to their rabbi or their rabbis, right? Depending on how many people are going to different rabbanim. Because at the end of life or on hospice or when dealing with serious illness, even if it's not the end of life, we as family members or close friends, we are overwhelmed. We are emotionally distraught. There is a lot going on. There's turmoil. I may be hearing something from the doctor or the nurse, but I'm not hopping everything that they're saying. And in my head, I am unwittingly filtering the information. So that if I then go to a RUV and say, guess what? They're telling me they don't want to feed my mother anymore. They don't want to give her IV. Well, guess what? That's not necessarily what the doctor or the nurse is saying. But I'm hearing it that way because of the situation that I'm in. And so it becomes very, very important that there be a direct conversation between the physician and the RUV. Because then if you're going to ask a shaila, and if already the RUV is going to paskin, and you're going to be bound by that sock, make sure that the question is asked based on the clinical reality, the accuracy of the clinical scenario, not what the perhaps distorted interpretation may be from an overwhelmed family member. That is also in part why the halachic medical directive is so important, because it avoids the issue of HIPAA. It allows the doctor to speak directly with the rabbi and the rabbi to speak directly with the physician. It is not to eliminate or extricate the family from the conversation. It's just to make sure that if the psak is going to be made, it's made based on the rabbi looking into the halachas based on the clinical, the metzius, based on reality. So that's very, very important. So what are some of the barriers? I'm doing a time check. I have just a few minutes left. There are a lot of barriers talking about end-of-life options. I don't want to go into this too much, but they really do revolve mostly around discomfort, emotional discomfort, and the anxieties attached to it. Sometimes there are families that are very, where there are significant conflicts among family members. That becomes a powder keg. So there's a lot of barriers that can come up, and that's why you, as a person who still has decisional capacity and knows yourself better than anyone else, you, when you are well and well enough to make decisions, should be thinking about this so that there are no machloket and no complications later when the family has to think about it for you. Some of the realities that we're dealing with today are probably represented in the group of people that are viewing this webinar, right? We're living in a different day and age. The sandwich generation has multiple family responsibilities. It could be to our parents if they were still alive, to our spouses, to our children, even to our grandchildren. Sometimes we don't have family that lives close by. Sometimes we don't have family at all. Sometimes there's a strange family. There's all different kinds of challenges that we face. And again, this is why having your advanced care plan in place and having directives completed makes life easier later on. It doesn't eliminate issues or problems or questions, but it makes it a lot easier. So how do you advocate for a loved one? You should really maximize your resources. And the earlier upstream you do it, the better it is. You have to consider who it is that you will look to for help. You have to look at what the needs are that your loved one may have. Not everybody's going to be able to handle those needs. You have to look at, in hospice, you get a few hours, for example, of home health aid, but it's not round the clock care. It's 15 or 20 hours a week of a home health aide. You need a lot more custodial support, and the family and circle of friends are expected to step up to the plate. So think about when people go to the hospital or nursing homes. We don't generally, I don't feel that people generally leave their loved ones alone. There's always somebody that's there with them for as much of the time as possible. And that's necessary because you have to advocate for that loved one, because guess what? No matter how good the hospital, the nursing home is, nobody knows your loved one the way you do. You look at your loved one, and in the blink of an eye, you know if something has changed. The people in the hospital and nursing home, they don't know them the same way. So it becomes very, very important to learn how to advocate for your loved one by helping the people that are caring for your loved one know who they are, what's important to them. If you had an aide that was caring for a loved one and your loved one was a chatterbox like me, I'm a big chatterbox. Would you want someone who's going to sit there like a bump on the log, listening to music all day or chatting on her text box all day? Or do you want them to pay attention to your loved one? Conversely, you might have somebody who likes to be by themselves. They're a loner or they're shy. They don't like people to intrude on their private time. It becomes very, very important to find a compatible person who could care for your loved one. Always ask questions. Always listen to look for and listen to nuances and things that are going on. And of great importance, it becomes very, very, very key that you learn how to self-advocate, whether it's for you or for others. If you don't help the others understand who your loved one is, what their life was like when they were well, then the chances are they will not be cared for in the best way possible when they are unwell. In order to be able to accomplish these kinds of conversations, you really do need to set the stage. I spoke more about this earlier, so I don't want to go into it. We may have time for a couple of questions, but it's essentially use seichel, right? Set the stage, use transparency so that you avoid machloket. Find out what you do know. What's the baseline of information that you do know? Then find out what you don't know, because there are a lot of questions. Don't assume that you know everything you need to know. Always speak to the expert, speak to the doctor, and have him explain to you also what you might anticipate that you're not thinking of because you've not dealt with this before. And be honest with your emotions. Recognize that it's hard and it's okay. Give yourself a pass. I'm done. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them. You have my email address, my work number, and my work cell number if there are any questions that you want to ask offline.
Toby, thank you so much. You gave us so much to think about, so much information. I do have a couple of questions before I do, though. One actually is one that I can actually answer, which is there was a question about the OU halachic medical directive. So I just want to make people aware, many years ago, before I actually came to the OU was involved with an organization about this. We are no longer involved. So please do not reach out to the Orthodox Union. And by the way, I think the RCA was directing people to the Orthodox Union, which still came to me. So that we are not the address for these questions. Rabbi Zone, when he spoke for us, he mentioned resources he can give out. So I will probably send people there because the OU is not that address. Okay?
So I could answer the Agudas Halachic Medical Directive is the one that most people are using. It is accessible online. I could probably send you an electronic version, but it is accessible online for anyone who looks for it. And they have done an amazing job. And they also have a registry so that once you fill out your halachic medical directive, it can also be documented in a registry so that there are no questions about the legitimacy. So look at the Agudas website or look at Chaim Aruchim. CHAYIM, Chaim Aruchim's website will also have the Agudas Halachic Medical Directive.
Okay, thank you. Okay, what is the difference between the living will and MOLST? There were a couple of questions about MOL.
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. I missed that one. Okay, so the MOLST, MOLST stands for Medical Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment. I'll repeat it. medical order for life-sustaining treatment. In New York State, we call it a MOLST. In many other states, it's called a POLST, physician order for life-sustaining treatment. What is unique and very important about this document is that it is a medical directive that is initiated by a physician, and it is signed by a physician, and it is filled out in a hospital or in a higher acuity care setting. Could be in a nursing home also, but generally in a hospital. When a discharge plan is being set up, a physician will have a conversation about these advanced directives, about your plan and your wishes, what you want, what you don't want. And he will fill it out. He or she, the doctor, will fill it out and sign it. And it will transport with that patient. It gets put onto a hot tank form, and it is sent with that patient when they are discharged to their next venue of care. This is very, very important for multiple reasons. As I mentioned earlier, the DNR does not travel with a patient when you leave a hospital. The MOLST form does. And because the physician is having the conversation with the patient, the physician is able to explain the different interventions and treatments that he is asking the patient about, and that the patient is telling him he wants or doesn't want. And it gets signed. And again, the most important variable that I want you to understand about the MOLST is that it travels with the patient to different venues. If a person goes to a nursing home, let's say for a rehab stay, and then they're going to be leaving the rehab, the doctor can change the order because their situation has changed. So it's a physician-initiated order that is an advanced directive.
Okay. We are really kind of out of time, but we want to thank Toby so much for all of this amazing information that we will need to address at some point in our lives. So I think that she was extremely, extremely helpful. Thank you so, so much. Next week, I want to just let everybody know that on Tuesday, we will be having a program with, it's called Grow Torah. And that'll be called Preparing for Tu B'Shvat. Grow Torah is an organization that actually was part of the OU's accelerator, first cohort of the accelerator. So we're very excited that they will be sharing with us how to properly prepare for Tu B'Shvat. Tu B'Shvat is on Thursday. And on Thursday, we'll be having a trip down memory lane. I will be having a conversation with Rena Yudkowsky, who I'm sure many of you, of course, know from all of our memory programs, and she'll be sharing some other tips with us that day. So that's Tuesday and Thursday. You'll be getting, of course, the registration information later today with the recording from this program. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Toby, thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you. Well, it's nice to see you now, Toby, without your mask. Toby and I go to the same shul, so we see each other on Shabbos, but I don't really see her. So it's nice to see you now. And take care, everybody. Have a great day. Have a great day. Have a good Shabbos. Be safe. Be healthy. Take care.
Thank you.